Greetings, good evening. Welcome to this live episode of the Innovate podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. In tonight's episode, I'll be debriefing the Better Way conference that I had the privilege of both speaking at as a panelist and as a speaker this week, as a panel host rather, and a speaker this weekend. I want to show you something to kick us off to start this conversation because it's indicative of the impact that this conference is having already. If you bear with me a moment, I'm going to share my screen if I can. I'm using a new browser at the moment, so it's actually making things difficult for me. Okay, I may not have the chance to show you this, but this is Vice magazine, or Vice, picked up on the conference, and the headline was as follows. The Davos of COVID conspiracy theorists is happening in a UK town right now. And it goes on to talk about, in, of course, slanderous terms, full of falsities, notions about the conference. But they were almost aghast at how professional and well put together the event is. Now, the reason why I say this is a positive story, even though it was a slanderous story that was put out actually prior to the event actually beginning, is because of this word Davos, because of course the World Economic Forum are gathering this week to explore their latest part of the agenda, and they must be quivering in their boots to some degree if they are now referring to the Better Way conference as the Davos. Clearly, they are building our tower for us. So I think in many ways, this is a very positive story. And of course, it's drawn a lot of attention to the event. So I had a great privilege of being involved in the event. I attended the full 3 days, and including some additional workshops just yesterday on the World Health Organization's treaty. So I want to use this opportunity to share my reflections from the event. I did do my best to soak up as much as the content as I possibly could, attending as many of the different panels and conversations over the course of the weekend. And of course, I will say it was lovely to meet so many of our podcast audience from across the last couple of years. So it's been a pleasure. If you said hello to me over the weekend, thank you so much for coming up to say hello. It was really nice to be amongst like-minded people for 3 days straight. It was like going back to a music festival. Those who've been to a music festival, you kind of detach from reality for a number of days. So I was out there. I was there pretty much from 9 till 9 every day until close of play, and then afterwards spending time with some of the other speakers and swapping ideas. But I'm going to kind of walk you through the overall event. I'll start by just summarizing my overall experience of the event, and to contrast it with what's happening in Davos right now. Davos, you've seen the photos of people rocking up in private jets and their limos to speak at a conference that is supposedly about equality and the environment. You can't really be any more hypocritical in your actions to turn up in such a way. Whereas you turn up to Bath, there was, most people I think took public transport. There was minimal parking anyway for masses of people to turn up in vehicles. But I only tell you that as a contrast to what's happening in Davos. But the primary contrast to me is the real nature of the people that we connect with at this event. There's such a different energy. Not that I've ever been to Davos, but you can just look at the screen and just see that it's a very stiff corporate environment in Davos. Everyone is suited. Everyone is hyper professional. Everyone is speaking in very technical terms, whereas you come to the Better Way conference and everyone is real. It's very bright. It's very energetic. It's very down to earth. And it's clearly an event for the people, by the people, whereas Davos is an elite gathering for the elites. So it's quite a distinct difference in style. But I absolutely loved the energy over the 3 days. There was some really incredible talks, some really fascinating insights. I learned a lot through the weekend. I think there were speakers from, I've lost track of how many countries, but just on the panel that I hosted, I had people from France, United States, Israel, and further afield. And, it was a really multicultural international event. And it was just really fascinating to see the experiences that people have been through across the world in the context of COVID-19. Now, the Better Way conference itself asked the question, how do we find a better way for a better world? And the lens of which is through primarily healthcare. It's an event that's put on by the World Council for Health, but it wasn't limited purely to health and healthcare. It did address other societal, cultural, political issues as well, but really dominantly through the lens of healthcare and how we can create a better way for health, which is obviously pertinent given what we've just been through with COVID. I'm only going to briefly comment on the monkey business around monkeypox today, but I did put a post on social media saying we may need to bring the Pandemic Podcast out of retirement to comment on such monkey business, because already much of the patterns and the same behaviors are already emerging in that space. So all of this is just further evidence that we require a real seismic shift in the way that we approach healthcare on a local, national, and international basis. And the event was basically hosted over 7 critical conversations. There were at least 3 out. Each of these conversations were at least 3 hours long, with multiple panels, multiple panelists. The first day began in the afternoon on Friday. A panel hosted by Del Bigtree. It was supposed to be a 3-hour session. I think it went on for 5.5 hours, but it was one of the most awe-inspiring and fascinating panels that I've seen, certainly in, many years that I've been going to events like these. And the first session was really addressing the biggest question of all, which is, how do we reclaim science, and what is our role in reclaiming science? Because, of course, there is almost this apathetic attitude that someone is going to come and save the day. Some organization or individual is going to come and fix the problem. Whereas, the systemic nature of the issues we're facing mean that we require a really concerted effort. And the duty is in all of our shoulders in order to do that. So I really like the question, how do we reclaim science, and what is our role in reclaiming science? And the panel addressed, who are you reclaiming science from, which I think is an important starting question. And it is very clear that it's the health regulatory bodies, big pharma in particular, philanthropic capitalists, media, politics. There are many institutions that have basically captured health. And it's become a very corporatized, profit-driven machine, whereas it really ought to be a patient-focused or a people-focused, because even using the term patient, it implies illness. Whereas over the course of the weekend, it was very clear that we need to address the way we look at health from a holistic and integrative way, where we're looking at preventative measures as much as we are curative, blending functional medicine with allopathic medicine, but we'll come to that. So reclaiming science on health regulatory bodies, big pharma, philanthropy capitalists, media, politics. The session really outlined the key problems, many of which, if you've been watching up my content for the last couple of years, should be no surprise. But the corruption within academia and the education system, many of these institutions that are performing science, the regulatory bodies themselves that are responsible for approval of drugs, really the end-to-end corruption of healthcare, in addition to the centralization and monopolization of healthcare. And, some of the presentations across the weekend started to examine the kind of ecosystem that is wrapped around the healthcare system. And it's really a really narrow number of organizations that essentially dominate the healthcare industry across the world. And the usual suspects are, of course, deeply entwined, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the major pharmaceutical companies, and then associated bodies like the WHO and related institutions. So it's a highly centralized, monopolized system that is really grounded and fundamentally grounded in pharmaceutical solutions. which really sets the tone for the profit incentive of the healthcare system. And to those, even if you haven't had a skeptical eye on the pandemic and COVID-19, I would really encourage most people to start to look at the economics of healthcare and to look at the structure of the industry. Because whilst there is a lot of independents out there that are doing great work in localized communities and stuff online, the main business of healthcare is owned and operated by a very few number of individuals and companies, and that is a very dangerous way for health to be managed. So the session talked about that dominance of big pharma, the monopolies, the capture of institutions, how academia is sponsored by big pharma, media is sponsored by big pharma, and it's all about the end result of drug sales as opposed to solving healthcare problems and helping people to prevent sickness and actually helping people to become healthy, because being healthy as individuals is not profitable to the healthcare system. And the session also looked at trends. I'm speaking here about reclaiming science, and it looked at the drug development trends, the kind of cultural and social elements around that, from mandates that we've been witnessing to the increasing pressure and new vaccination schedules and other schedules that are being ramped up across populations across the world. Looked at some of the technological developments such as hackable humans and transhumanism, which interestingly is probably the topic of Davos right now, but in a completely different context. And looked at fraud, the increasing fraudulent use of data and the inappropriation of funds to actually secure media coverage of fraudulent data. Robert Malone, Dr. Robert Malone, who is many of you will know, was at the event. Had a good opportunity to meet Robert. He's a lovely man, very wise man, very deep wisdom in his field, but also a broader knowledge of the industry that he has operated in for many years. And he shared a really powerful quote, which was that we are luminous beings, not economic units. However, the healthcare system itself treats us as economic units. So we really do need to start fundamentally rethinking how we do find a better way for health, which of course is what the entirety of the conference was focused on. Of course, it would be inappropriate for the event in its opening session to not touch on COVID and the issues that has come out of the COVID chapter, issues particularly with the drugs, the vaccines and the reporting. And then Brett Weinstein gave a really interesting take on the situation and spoke about, rather than needing to reclaim science, we ought to be looking at how we rebuild science, and recognizing the time that will take, generational work, building new institutions from the ground up with a new set of values, in order to actually transform the healthcare. Because if we are looking to kind of pull the rug out from underneath the existing system and derail the existing efforts, then we may get some successes, but it's institutionally so tightly woven and entangled around these profit centers that actually it would take a real seismic shift in order to make the house of cards collapse, so to speak. So on one hand, there is a need for activism and resistance, particularly when it comes to specific issues, but there was an overarching sentiment that a new system is required, and it's creativity and building up from the ground that will likely be the real solution to the problem. And that really set the tone then for the rest of the weekend. So there was a few key ideas. There's 5 key ideas that I'll share that I took from the first opening session on reclaiming science. One is that we need to decouple corporate interests and the profit motive from healthcare. 2 is we need to build new institutions with new values and new funding methods. Number 3, how do we drive towards more of an open source, transparent culture where disclosure is the norm, while still respecting individual privacy and putting the privacy back into the hands of people when it comes to their own data. 4, how do we use legal and regulatory mechanisms to tackle corruption, fraud, and the monopolization of these healthcare systems? I studied economics at school and at university, and we talked about the national monopolies commissions, but we now live in a global world where there is a distinct lack of global regulation of this monopolistic type behavior. But that in itself comes with challenges. We regularly hear about the NWO and this pursuit of one world government, which I can understand the fears around, because that poses a whole new set of problems that would just amplify everything that we've just talked about. And I laugh because it's sadly the kind of the trajectory that we're on. But I also simultaneously, in Common Sense Corner, recognize the need here, as I've just stated, to tackle global organizations, without splitting them up into individual regional territories, which is an option. There does need to be some sort of international governance that regulates these big centralized monopolies, because otherwise they can continue to get away with what they're getting away with. So some sort of globally agreed standards around economic policy when it comes to monopolies is surely something that's in the interests of the planet and the people. And then number 5, how to remove the veil of corporate immunity, because many of these organizations, whether it's drug companies or the WHO itself, have economic and legal immunity, which means that it's very, very difficult to hold these organizations to account. So there's some really key ideas there that need to be pursued. And of course, that's, as we know, there's no quick fixes here, but there are things that can be done in order to accelerate the process. So there's a really inspiring first session, which concluded with a really fascinating debate. Those of you who have been watching the Pandemic podcast prior to the Elevate podcast may have seen my interview with Gerd van den Bosch, who was at the conference. Such a lovely guy. I got to spend quite a bit of time with Gerd. He was so keen to share his wisdom. Anyone that wanted to interview him, he would go ahead and give his time with a smile. But what was fascinating on the Friday night was a lengthy debate between Del Bigtree, who obviously has a long history tackling vaccinations, drug development, vaccine-related injuries, both in terms of principle, but also in terms of legalities. He's mounted many legal cases over the years. He's had face-to-face time with some of the health regulatory bodies, including the governmental bodies. Contrast that with Gerd van den Bosch, who's a vaccinologist who spent his entire career developing vaccines. But there was a really, really good-spirited and intense, but good-spirited debate between the two of them, weighing up the risks of the vaccines versus the risks of actually the potential loss of herd immunity if there was no alternative to vaccinations. And there was a real point of agreement. The fascinating thing was the point of agreement that they came to, which is what they have, what their unknowns are and what assumptions they're working upon. But it, to me, was just a model debate. It was a fascinating, respectful, energetic debate where it didn't reduce to any slander or, name calling. It was a very friendly but intense debate. And to me, that sets the standard. That set the standard on day one that, this isn't, and it was repeatedly stated throughout the conference, this isn't a conference that people all think the same in a homogenized way, that we all want the exact same things. If we all wanted the same things, we'll just end up building the same systems that we've got prior to this. So it was really great to see that kind of variety of debate on the first night. But there's definitely some new opportunities, whether it's new medical journals, new media, new modes of healthcare systems, new education systems. So an inspiring first day. Day 2, I had the pleasure of hosting the first panel of the day on day 2, which was about managing the consequences of mass immunization and some of the issues through the COVID-19 chapter. It really focused on 3 key things, which is number 1, the suppression of data. Number 2, the suppression of vaccine injuries. Number 3, the suppression of treatments. And number 4, actually, the suppression of conversation around these 3 things. So we looked in depth at the evidence around some of the early treatment options for COVID, including ivermectin. We looked at ivermectin extensively. And what was fascinating, we had people from many different countries, where we had someone from Zimbabwe, France, Brazil, talking about their data, the US, Britain, talking about their data from real that not only their real experience of treating patients and the results they've been having, but the scientific papers that they've been using to justify the use of ivermectin and other drugs. And I may get banned for using the word ivermectin in a positive sense during this conversation, but it was the stories were overwhelming. Multiple doctors in multiple nations sharing very, very similar stories. It was evident that this is a real issue that needs to be addressed. And then the big second piece was around vaccine injuries and the suppression of those vaccine injuries, and the devastating stories actually that how those who have been vaccine injured have been treated. They've been labeled anti-vaxxers, which is just, if you think about it for a moment of your time, how ridiculous that statement is. Because if you're vaccine injured, then you've taken the vaccine. So what kind of anti-vaxxer takes a vaccine? So they've been labeled anti-vaxxers for sharing the drugs, the drug harms that they've experienced. They've been subject to psychological abuse. They've been gaslit. It was just so sad to hear these stories. But many of them shared the opportunity here that because of the way that they've been treated, it creates a bridge between those who have chosen to be vaccinated and those who have chosen not to be, so that we can have a broader conversation. But the session really concluded on the need for physiological medical support for those who've been injured, because a lot of people have kind of been left out to dry because, there's this denial of any injury, despite physical manifestation of these injuries. There's not just denial, there's also an unknown quantity about it. People don't know how to treat some of these issues. And then there's the psychological implications from the way they've been ostracized and treated by other people. So it was a really fascinating conversation. It really highlighted the issues that we have. But there were some initial sparks of conversation about how we can move forward from this and ensure that this doesn't happen again. So from session 2, we walked on to conversation 3, which is about how do we actively create a better world. Again, I had the opportunity to participate in this one as a keynote speaker. That didn't exactly, for those of you in the room, well, no, I didn't quite give a keynote. It was quite different. Neil Oliver, our dear friend Neil Oliver, hosted that panel. I took us on a bit of an interactive experience. I'll leave it there for now. Basically had the whole room dancing. For those of you who've seen the Derek Sivers video about how to build a movement, there's a famous video where there's a lone dancer in a field at a festival, dancing all wildly, going crazy. He's by himself, and you look at the guy and everyone's thinking, who's this madman dancing? But after a period of time and persistent dancing, he's then joined by his first follower, whereby that person begins dancing like crazy. And then a little bit of time passes, and then the third, and again the fourth. And by the time the fourth and fifth start to arrive, people are flooding in to join the party. And I demonstrated this viscerally on the stage because I was so inspired by two of my fellow speakers, Mega Werner and Rain Trozzi, who have both joined us from Canada, both young speakers. They gave such inspirational talks about how we can, how the youth is uprising, and which has been, a topic that we've been focused here on the podcast because, the youth have been missing in this conversation in general. We look at our podcast data and I think, am I getting old because I'm only reaching people my age and above? Am I not down with the kids? Do I need to start doing TikTok videos? And I joked about not wanting to do dancing TikTok videos, and there I was dancing on stage, but that's a different matter. But Mega talked about the pursuit of truth does not come without risk. She spoke about the shackles of the education system and the linear nature of it and how it's actually suppressing young people. It was a really fascinating talk. And then Rain, who is the son of Dr. Trozzi, talked about young people stepping forward and how courage is contagious. He also spoke about the problems of the linear education system and how it's basically a production line, and it really marginalizes creativity. It creates groupthink. He talked about how there's lack of a social acceptance about questioning and lack of social acceptance around things like spirituality. So he really spoke about how, both of them really spoke about how stifling the education system's been, and attributed some of those issues to the lack of or the absence of young people in this particular issue. And he also noted how this is the generation with the most at stake. But he's created an organization to attract young people. He's really ambitious, as is Mega, about building a movement of young people to actually tackle some of these issues, given that they are the generation with the most at stake. I had the pleasure of interviewing them both at the event. Watch out for that podcast coming up soon. Then we heard from Val Fraser, our dear Val from Safer to Wait. She ran the campaign targeting stopping the children. Well, in fact, encouraging parents to wait when it comes to child vaccination. She shared all of the methodology around their messaging, how they got the message out, how they got coverage in the media, and shared what they've been doing in order to really take a stand against childhood vaccinations when it comes to COVID-19. And then we heard, in conclusion, a presentation from James Todaro looking at how decentralization can occur through technology. He shared details of how the blockchain can be used to accelerate the return and reclamation of free speech. He also talked about how decentralized financial systems can help bring financial sovereignty and start to break some of the pillars of inequality. And then the session was concluded by my dear friend Nick Hudson, who brought a really philosophical perspective to the overall conversation about building active communities and creating change, commenting on culture, community, and the need to decentralize. That was panel 3. Panel 4 was one of my most favored panels. It was about media sovereignty. It talked about media capture and how much money is spent by the pharmaceutical industry on sponsorship of these different media entities, but not just Big Pharma. The American government spent over $1 billion on ensuring that the vaccines are promoted in American media. Talked about the Trusted News Initiative and how any misinformation would be suppressed. The segment talked about the skills gap in the fact that we don't have any real scientists who are also journalists out there challenging. But we also talked about in the panel the need to create financial security and support for new media, because ultimately people like myself and other independents are reliant upon the kind of donations from our audience, whereas you've got these big entities that you're able to do so much more because of their funding sources. So we looked at creating security for new media and actually transferring funding sources away from traditional media to new media. We looked at it from two lenses, really. One from ensuring that new media can survive and grow and thrive, but also from a perspective of making sure that actually that the agenda of new media is not created by its sponsors. It's a way of democratizing new media and ensuring that the media is for the people by the people in that way. But we also talked about the challenges of new media. I say we, I wasn't involved in the panel on this one, but there was a fascinating panel. Mark Shalman was involved, Anna Breeze, Brett Weinstein, various others, Del Bigtree, talking about how we need to build credibility and how we need to restore trust, how we need to innovate, how we need to push the line, how we need to simplify our communication to make sure that we kind of tackle these complex material in a way that can be understood. Because when you're bringing on experts, you've got those difficulties of actually communicating complex information. So it talked about how we can build relatability, relevancy, keeping information real. But ultimately, the whole piece was around courageous journalism, building trust and credibility and sustainability, financial sustainability with the new media, again, as a better way forward, rather than trying to change old media, looking at how we can actually build new media. Then session 5, I've sadly missed, unfortunately. I was in meetings and had some opportunities to interview some of the speakers. So but the 5th session was about how law can serve human rights. Now, it's a very important conversation. I can't comment on it because I wasn't there. But there were some amazing speakers looking at, from an international perspective, what legal cases have been successful in different nations, but also different approaches to hold politicians and institutions to account. And that's such a vital component. So if you were at the event and you took some takeaways from the legal segment, feel free to put it inside the comments. It'd be lovely to hear your takeaways from that particular segment. The next panel was addressing the environmental challenges pertaining to health and how certain, again, corporatized and profit-driven organizations are acting in ways that are not conducive to our public health. Everything from the use of chemicals, contamination, EMF, 5G, other chemicals like fluoride and all the fluoridation of the water. These were some of the key issues that were addressed within that panel, and concluded with the need to return to nature, natural principles, localization, and regaining sovereignty over food systems, for instance. And again, the kind of key takeaway was as much about resistance as it is rebuilding. And these are really two critical terms that we've been using at Elevate, in fact, which was great to see a synergy over the weekend. But resistance and rebuilding, because I think if we spend 20% of our time resisting the old, then it frees up 80% to build the new. But I've listened to some fascinating interviews from people who have been in the activism game for a lifetime, and many will concur that it's about getting the right balance between tackling policy issues and actually building new institutions that can actually free us from the problems that they were actually fighting. And then the final session of the day was, again, one of the most interesting of all, which is about how do we innovate new approaches to healthcare. And what I loved most about it was that it really does get into this kind of yin and yang of nature and technology, because in times like this, when there's high levels of kind of technocratic leadership, we're seeing the profitization of healthcare, corporatization. We're seeing some great technological innovations that can support the health outcomes of humanity, but we're also seeing some invasive measures such as mass surveillance, mass testing, as we saw with COVID-19. So we need to look at how innovation can be used in a positive sense, but also how we can curb the effects of innovation that may actually bring adverse consequences for humankind and the planet. So the session looked at how we innovate but blend with nature, looking at integrated approaches to healthcare, marrying the preventative with the curative models, bringing in allopathic traditional kind of education-led medicine, hospital-led medicine, combining that with other holistic approaches, looking at decentralized models to localized models to healthcare, community-driven models for healthcare, people-centric models, looking at a values-led healthcare approach, and ultimately putting healthcare sovereignty into the individual's hands, because we've got a culture at the moment where it's about simple, fast solutions, which usually involves drugs, and that culture itself is damaging to our health. You know, we need to be taking responsibility for our own preventative health to keep ourselves vibrant and energized and youthful, but also to take responsibility for the patient journey in collaboration with our healthcare partners. In many ways, it's a partnership between ourselves and those who can help guide us to better health. And there was some really interesting models shared. Rob Verkerk, a good friend of mine from the Alliance of Natural Health, shared a really interesting presentation in one slide, the decades worth of work that looked at a really interesting model for new health. So in conclusion, you know, that if you walk through the 7 sessions, reclaiming or rebuilding science, managing the consequences from the COVID-19 chapter, actively creating a better world and communities, looking at media sovereignty, looking at how law can serve human rights, looking at how we can manage the environmental consequences that can be challenging our health, and looking at innovative approaches to healthcare. The summit itself, the conference itself, did a really good job of painting with clarity the issues that we're facing, and really with nuance, and started to touch upon and grow upon the better way, the idea of creating a better way. and what can be done to start to innovate, improve, iterate, and grow. But the reality is, even after hearing over 60 speakers over the course of 3 days, it's very clear that there's some fine minds working on these big problems. But it's even more clear that we all have a role to play in order to define and create a better way. And it's also very clear that the solution is in this kind of emergent phase, in that there are lots of ideas. There's some really interesting kind of grassroots action being taken to improve healthcare systems. There's some really good localized initiatives, but it was evident that we're at the early days of sophistication when it comes to tackling both the core problem of the kind of corporatization and centralization of healthcare, and building something that is really people-centric. Dr. Jessica Rose spoke virtually. She's one of the most credible scientists that I know that's spoken about the vaccine injuries. She's also one of the most highly regarded scientists that's had the opportunity to feed data into the WHO and other organizations. Her message was really around, aside from all the data she presented, is about how we reclaim health, how we reclaim health, and rather than be seen as an economic opportunity, be seen as an opportunity to advance humankind, and actually preserve human health. And we've got to start looking at healthcare from a different lens. And if the incentive is all about profit, then how can health ever be the true outcome? That's not to say that there's not room for economics in the healthcare system. The reality is work has to be funded, technology has to be funded. It's just looking at the conflicts of interest, the corporatization and the monopolization and the centralization, and the damage that has. I think many of us are clear, even if people haven't been skeptical of the COVID narrative. I think most people are clear that this over-centralization, this monopolistic corporate job of a healthcare system is not appropriate for the modern world. So we've got work to do. And we've all got a role to play. And Tess recently shared with our community in the Elevate network, the most empowering thing that any individual can do right now to transform the healthcare system is to transform your own health, because we need to remove the reliance on the healthcare system. And the best way to do that is becoming vital and healthy, and taking care of our own health journey and taking responsibility for how we can improve our nutrition, our mindfulness habits, our sleep, fitness, our movement, our exercise, getting into nature, understanding how we can really optimize our own state of well-being, both through nature and through technology, in order to actually reduce our own requirement to access these kind of corporate health structures, whilst these new models are emerging. Michelle asks, how can we compete against the WF and the WHO? It's a good question. The towers are very, very tall. I think, and it's interesting because my old philosophy has always been it's better to build your own tower than try to knock someone else's down. And I still kind of maintain that. But the reality is we're dealing with some very big towers and we're only just beginning. And I forget the name of the individual, but the gentleman who founded the idea of the B Corporation, which at its heart is a model where companies are built with positive intent to actually directly focus on the consumer, enhancing the consumer's lives, rather than being all about money. But he once stated that he believed that they could build a new way of running business, but his life lessons has shown him that he also has to tackle the old, and you still have to resist the incumbents. So I think it's about making sure that we are tackling issues as they come up, but focusing on building a new system that's so attractive that we actually start to attract people from those old systems because they become obsolete. And I do believe we are seeing that obsolescence coming out. I think the systems that we're currently dealing with have the seed of their own demise built in. They are legacy now. The old notion of, a barge turning in the ocean, it takes a long time for a barge to turn in the ocean, whereas a speedboat can pivot on a dime, on a penny. So we have speed and creativity on our side, but we also have the truth when it comes to a lot of the issues. I appreciate truth can be quite subjective, and we had some interesting discussions about speaking our individual truth and finding the truth, the the actual measurable objective truth, which does not necessarily correlate with our own individual truth. That was a fascinating discussion that we had in the breakout areas. One speaker said that he was focused on speaking his truth, but other people had pointed out that their conclusions aren't necessarily scientifically verifiable. So at this stage, so there's a difference between speaking our own personal truth, and to me, without going on too much of a sideline, personal truth is about principles, it's about values, it's about a map of the world, it's about how it's an attitude, it's our character. Whereas the more objective truth is the kind of material, mechanistic, measurable, observable reality. That's a philosophical conversation that I won't get into now. But I want to sum up that is a hugely inspiring conference. Very long days. For me personally, I was traveling to and from the event and trying to spend as much time as I could with the other speakers in the evening, just to learn as much as I can. But hugely inspiring, and it's just great to see people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, coming together to start to look at how we can find a better way. And what I really love about that term, a better way, it's so universally applicable. And what we know from the mainstream media and the other major corporates is they have these catchphrases like "build back better" that people use all over the media. Well, I think it's time we start coming up with our own catchphrases. And you may have seen the video, which is where which really shows the impact of the Trusted News Initiative. There was a syndicated conversation where they put about 40 different videos on the screen from different news channels around the world, where they literally reported the same story in the exact same way, using the exact same words. Now, I don't think we should do that. We could be a bit more creative than that. But if we can start getting the term a better way into media and speaking in the same language, then we become a counterforce to be reckoned with, particularly now as we've got these big conferences taking place. We've got Davos going on. We've got the World Health Organization's meeting this week. There's another big conference taking place at the same time. These corporates are really driving things forward. So we need to be nimble, we need to be agile, and we need to find ways to tackle these the obsolete model whilst building the new. So people are asking, how can you get access to the footage? You can go to the betterwayconference.org and purchase the footage. I appreciate, I've seen people talking about ticket prices and such. I know from working closely with the team that this event cost an awful lot of money to put on. And there was a silent auction and all kinds of things to help fund the event. But still, the costs were mounting up. We have to realize that, these professional events do come with a cost. And as much as all of us want to democratize access to these types of things, we're in a position as I mentioned through this podcast, is that we need to support those organizations and individuals that are doing things differently, because otherwise, this is why these other big organizations go to corporate sponsors, because it costs a lot of money to do these things. So to prevent that from happening, we need to distribute the cost base of these activities across the public. So I appreciate that may still leave, I recognize that may mean that some people aren't able to access some of these things. But again, that comes down to working together and making sure that no one is left out. But that's just a side note on the economics of these things. We've really, really got to realize that in order to build a better way, we do need to use public funding, as in crowdsourced funding, to avoid going down these corporate sponsorship routes. So, it's an interesting one, but it's finding new ways to fund the new systems of tomorrow is part of the conversation, and that's still emerging. So I'm excited for the future ahead. I've taken a ton of notes. I've got 2 notebooks full here of scrawlings. Tomorrow evening, inside of the Elevate network, if you're not familiar with the Elevate network, it's our private community. We're going to be doing another debrief on the conference with our members, the opportunity to interact and share ideas. So if you're at the conference with us at the weekend, or you watched live at home, I encourage you to join the Elevate network. Come and join our post-event discussion tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'm hoping to bring some of the speakers or organizers from the event to come and join us, so that we can have an interactive discussion. We can start to extract some of the lessons and start to kind of really pose ways that we can actually play a role in driving towards a better way for health. So I invite you to join us inside the Elevate network. You can go to weareelevate.org, and you can join us inside the Elevate network tomorrow night. And lastly, if you haven't yet tuned into our audio podcast, if you're watching live here on video, you obviously know where to find us on the video, but you can also now listen to us on Spotify, Apple, and all the major audio platforms. You can listen to us on the go. So have a look now for the podcast on all major platforms. Just type in Elevate with Dan Astin-Gregory. And lastly, if you're not on our mailing list, then please do join our email list, where we can keep you updated on our conversations, our interviews, our content, and future events. So go to danastingregory.com/podcast. All right, that's enough for me for now. I feel like I've been talking all weekend, so I need to give my voice a break. Thanks for tuning in. Great to see some of you there at the weekend. Lovely to spend time with some of you, and look forward to seeing you inside the Elevate network tomorrow for our debrief. We've got some conversations and interviews that took place during the course of the conference coming out this week, so look out for those. Really, now is the time that we move forward and continue to work together.